How are you? Juan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Excellent. I, where are you located, Juan?
I'm located in. I recently joined as a visiting student. I joined PRTS
Okay. Okay.
to do some church history courses.
Very good. Very good. I think I accidentally someone was waiting to be admitted to our group, and I think I accidentally uninvited him. Whoops, I think I hit the wrong key. Let me try and solve a problem I've created and then be back to you again in a minute.
It wasn't me, was it?
No, it wasn't. Okay. So, brother, I'm trying to think of how to say your name. Uh,
So hey everyone. So my name is Kaique.
Keiki.
Yes,
Keiki.
I'm here from Brazil.
All right. Nice to meet you, Keiki.
Yeah, just finished last week my TAM course on PRTS
Okay.
partnership through Martin Bucer Seminar here in
Okay.
Brazil.
Well, that's good. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So
Sir.
you say that last week you finished your TA
Yes,
count.
the last week. Yeah.
Wow, that's wonderful. Praise the Lord. That's
Praise
great.
the Lord. Yeah.
I'm just checking to make sure I'm not accidentally excluding people. I think I hit the wrong button once. I'm feeling a little bit poorly about that. Well, I spoke to Greg earlier today, and at that time he seemed to remember that we would be together. Let's see if he remembers now, unless there's people waiting here and I haven't figured it out. That's also possible. Welcome, gentlemen. We're just waiting a few extra minutes. One of our competent host has had technical difficulties. That's why we're stuck with me. I hope this will all work. So, hello, Nathan. It's good to see you. It's been some time now, hasn't it?
It has been. It's good to see you as well.
How are you keeping yourself from excesses of trouble?
Well, being in the city of Los Angeles, the governor keeps us out of all sorts of trouble. So we must check in with him unless we're going to the French Laundry. But.
Yeah, I hear you. Dear me. Well, welcome, Dr. Salazar. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Dr. Van Dixhorn?
Good. I like your study, but it looks like, wouldn't you be tempted to sleep there sometimes?
Well, every once in a while, you know, every once in a while. It's a little different from yours, but.
Yeah, mine is well, I can be tempted to sleep almost anywhere, to be honest. So, Greg, we're just waiting for a couple more people. I had someone appear on here, and I think I hit the wrong button and chucked them off again, for which, you know, I feel kind of poorly. It was an accident, I insist, but we'll see.
They're predestined.
Yeah, thanks, James, for that enriching comment. Yes. Are you doing well, Brother Salazar?
I am. I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Things are in flux here, as in most of the country, but things are doing well. My kids have been out of school for a number of weeks now, so it made it challenging. Hopefully, you won't hear them rustling in the background. They're downstairs, and they've been instructed to be quiet. So, well,
that's wonderful, and no doubt in your household, once instructed, everything follows through quite smoothly.
Smooth as, you know, very, very smoothly.
It's encouraging to think of your well-ordered home. Yes, I hope you hear my teenagers antagonize each other as they return home from school, weary and snack deprived. I trust all will be well here too. Well, I'm just grateful to you all. Thanks for being here. Alexander Brown, not had a chance to say hello. Where do you hail from?
I'm down on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and a piece down there.
Okay, great.
But well, originally from Scotland.
That's right. I am in exile currently.
Ah, yes. Okay. Well, this is our second seminar by Zoom. It's remarkable. It's sort of a testimony to people's interest in Puritanism, and Greg in particular, that anyone would be willing to venture one more Zoom conversation during these very Zoomy days. The Craig seminar kicked off in my first year here. We meet about once monthly. We used to meet in person, and we hope to once more. But the great thing about the one benefit of doing things by Zoom is that we can hear from others who are a little bit further away and whose busy schedules may not have allowed them to travel to Philadelphia. So we're looking forward to hearing Paulie Haw in England later, Tim Cooper from New Zealand, not all tonight, you'll be happy to hear, as well as our own PhD students. I do want to say that if you have, if Puritan has a student with a sizzling paper, we are not closed to the idea. We're open. Let me be more positive. We're open to the idea of PhD students from elsewhere giving an occasional paper too. So the Craig seminar is sponsored in part by the Presbyterian and Reformed publishers And on a good day, you could come to Philadelphia and you would sit through a live paper, have about a 45-minute paper, 45-minute Q&A, and then we'd go out and eat together, all on the Craig Center's dime. So hopefully someday each one of you will be in the Philadelphia area, and you can taste our exquisite cuisine. As you know, today's seminar speaker is Dr. Greg Salazar, who is a minister in the PCA, graduate of RTS and Cambridge. And his paper, which we'll get to in a moment, is entitled "No Man Can Serve Two Masters: Puritanism, Calvinist Conformity, and Ecclesiastical Positioning at the Westminster Assembly and during the 1640s." But just before you get there, why don't you treat us with a brief update on your current research interests, if you will, Dr. Salazar, and different publication projects, things that you're sort of firmly committed to, as well as a couple teasers about things you might be praying about, and then launch into your paper. Are you willing to do that little bit of extra for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Shad, for having me as a part of this. I've been an admirer of the Craig Center and the Craig Seminar and everything that you all are pursuing there at Westminster Seminary now for a number of years since the idea was first birthed. I'm grateful too for Dr. Van Dixhoorn. This paper and my PhD thesis was really birthed out of a conversation that I had first with Hunter Powell, who did his PhD work at Cambridge as well, and then at a Panera Bread conversation that I had in DC back in 2013, right before starting my PhD studies with Chad. And so I really think of Chad as being the spark plug for my own doctoral work and for the interest in this topic. Right now, I am preparing not only this paper is a part of a chapter, which is part of a larger publication project that's due in about 8 months' time to Oxford University Press to be published in the Oxford Studies in Historical Theology series, edited by Richard Muller. I'm also working on a number of articles. One is going to be on William Perkins and him as a moderate Puritan. That issue has been looked at a bit in some of the previous work, and particularly by Brown Patterson, but a lot of the archival work is still yet to be done. So I'm working on that, as well as, Lord willing, going to be editing an Oxford Handbook to Puritanism with Anne Hughes and Francis Bremer, that we've submitted our proposal, and we're told that we'll hear back by the 1st of February, maybe even in January. And the Oxford University Press is very excited about this potential project, and we're just in the process right now gathering contributors for that. I'm also working on an article for kind of a journal slash, you could call it a hardback publication project that Mordecai Feingold, who's currently writing a biography right now of John Reynolds, who I'm going to mention in this paper, an article following up on some of the things that I wasn't able to do in terms of manuscript research for my PhD work on Daniel Featley's early years. And then I'm involved with Dr. Van Dixhoorn and others in the works of Samuel Rutherford, transcribing the printed or the manuscript sermons and the printed sermons, although I'm going to be focusing mainly on the unpublished manuscript sermons. It's a 12-volume project. I'll just be co-editing one of them with two other gentlemen, one of whom is a PhD student of ours, Mark Kohler, another is Matthew Vogan. And I'll be working on the unpublished sermons of Samuel Rutherford. Long-term projects, I've just been contracted to write a history of Puritanism for Reformation Heritage Books that will be a companion volume to Joel Beeke's A Puritan Theology. And it's meant to be a comprehensive overview of Puritanism that also I would hope not hagiographically, but in a real robust way, makes present application to the church. Obviously, I'm only going to be able to do a surface treatment of that. And then the next academic book I'd love to write is a work on Puritan practical divinity from an academic standpoint. That's actually the chapter I'll be writing in the Oxford Handbook of Puritanism. I've corresponded some with people like John Coffey, who know the field quite well on that issue, and just sort of throwing it out there. Is this something that's needed? And I think it is indeed. So it's just a little smattering of what I'm sort of hoping to do and working on. I think I've probably got my plate too full, like usual, with too many projects, but it'll keep me busy now for the next decade or so.
Amen. That sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Salazar. So I eagerly await all of these different worthwhile projects, and your paper this afternoon.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I thought one way I would begin is by just giving a brief introduction to where this actually sits in the broader context of my work, and giving you a little introduction to who, in particular, Daniel Featley was, because I think he's not as well known of a figure. He is a Westminster divine, although I'll point out that I don't think he actually was a Puritan, something that obviously we can debate. But I want to give an introduction here to my work and an introduction to Featley, and then turn to the paper itself, which focuses on Featley in the 1640s and Calvinist conformity, that is, non-Puritan Episcopalians during the 1640s. So Daniel Featley was one of the most fascinating Calvinist conformist figures of the post-Reformation English age, particularly the early Stuart age. As a young man, he studied at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, under the tutelage of the great Puritan divine John Reynolds, who was a Puritan representative at the Hampton Court Conference. He was the youngest translator of the authorized version and was Archbishop George Abbott's domestic chaplain. He was a major anti-Catholic polemicist as well. He was also a prolific writer. His best-selling work, Ancilla Pietatis, was published in 1626, and this was a private devotional work that went through 9 different editions and was published on the continent as well in both Dutch and French. He was an active preacher and published a book called Clavis Mystica, which was a compilation of many of his sermons. It was 900 pages, 70 sermons published over the course of his career. As a result of his opposition to Calvinism, anti-Calvinism, and Laudianism, he was reprimanded several times during the 1620s and the 1630s, including having 17 folio pages struck out of that sermon collection, which was, of course, a major practice at the time was censorship, particularly in the 1630s under William Laud, although certainly not exclusively something that happened in the Caroline period. Nevertheless, in the late 1630s, he was appointed as a royal chaplain to Charles I and preached twice at court in 1639 and 1641. And as a result of his sympathies with royalism and episcopacy, as we will see, he endured 2 different quite dramatic attacks on his life. Despite these 2 attacks, Featley was the only royalist Episcopalian figure of roughly 15 who were invited, who accepted his invitation to the assembly and participated in a meaningful way. Nevertheless, on the 30th of September, 1643, 3 months into the assembly, Featley was charged with being a royalist spy, was imprisoned by Parliament, and died shortly thereafter on the 17th of April, 1645. Now, within the study of English Reformed divines, much attention has been paid to either moderate or nonconformist Puritans, strictly speaking. However, less attention has been given to those who were devoted to Calvinism, but also were devoted to royalism and episcopacy. That is, those Calvinist conformist figures who were firmly within the established church and represented, you could say, the majority position between 1560 and the mid 1620s before being marginalized by the Laudians in the 1630s, and then obviously by the Puritans in the 1640s. Although these figures have been examined within the context of more general studies, specific treatment to them has not really been done. Now, the exception to that is, of course, Archbishop James Ussher, who has been looked at in great detail, especially Alan Ford's fine biography published with Oxford University Press a number of years ago. Now, while historians have been divided about whether Featley was a moderate Puritan or a Calvinist conformist, both in my work and in this paper, I want to argue that Featley is squarely within the Calvinist conformist camp. It also, my broader work, looks at the difficulties of actually defining Puritanism, Calvinist conformity, etc., and the difficulty of employing clean-cut labels. Now, the overall aim, just to give you the Cliff Notes, version of my forthcoming publication that's coming out, is that it really has a twofold aim. First, it examines how Featley's convictions were representative of the theological ideals and the career of conformist Calvinism. This was something that I didn't give as much attention to during my work. During my PhD thesis, I gave a bit more attention to what I'll touch on here in a minute, the second part of the work that really focuses on the political flexibility of English Calvinist conformity. But one of the things that was pointed out to me by John Coffey in my examination, he really said, you know, what you ought to think about, though, is although he's flexible, that flexibility exists within certain bounds, certain guardrails. If you think about, you know, a bowling alley, you know, there are certain limitations on the flexibility. And so the thesis has really been expanded to looking at these theological ideals and the career of conformist Calvinism. That is how Featley is representative not only of himself, but of a whole cohort of divines. Where are they willing? What are the sort of bounds of their Calvinist conformity? Now, much attention has rightly been given to demonstrating how Puritans were staunchly committed to a rigorous system of theological principles and volunteer piety, what we know today as the hot Protestants. However, this emphasis could obscure the fact that actually other English Reformed divines were likewise resolutely committed to a distinct and set of doctrines and ecclesiastical practices. So the broader work really looks at how throughout his life, Featley maintained a consistent commitment to a set of theological priorities and convictions. And these convictions were characteristic of Calvinist conformity. These include, among others, stringent anti-Catholicism, Reformed soteriology, a sensitivity to crypto-Catholicism, upholding the magistrate's rule, over one's private conscience on things in difference. I would say that's something that makes them different from, say, a pure Puritan divine, a settled aversion to Protestant sectarianism, and an unwavering commitment to royalism. Now, while these qualities are not unique to Calvinist conformist divines, and let me underline that, I am not making that argument. Some were shared by Puritans and others, that's true. Collectively, though, this is the portfolio of the priorities and principles, the theological bounds and constraints that were typical of Calvinist conformity. However, the work also looks at how Featley's career traces the fortunes of Calvinist conformists as they navigated the shifting ecclesiastical terrain of post-Reformation England. It explores the various roles that he played in the post-Reformation English church and examines the priorities and political maneuvers. And I think the political maneuvers is the key phrase there, that English Calvinist conformist divines pursued. And particularly it looks at the politics of religion in post-Reformation England. Sadly, a topic that's often neglected in many seminary studies, a very important theme of this period. It explores the broader historical theological themes, like the role and dynamics of ecclesiastical patronage, the ecclesiastical politics of licensing works for publication, the links between a minister's pastoral motivations and polemical engagements. Those things are not mutually exclusive, they go together. And the survival strategies, and that's key for the paper that we're going to be looking at today, the survival strategies that these ministers use to survive the significant challenges of the shifting ecclesiastical terrain. In these ways, the work explores Featley's theology, his multifaceted career, and then links this story and theology to the broader political, religious, and intellectual history of the period, and is a lens through which we can understand Calvinist conformity, Puritanism, and English Reformed theology. So with that broader introduction, we're going to be looking at the way in which, and these themes really feature in the 1640s, surface in Featley's attendance at the Westminster Assembly, his imprisonment by Parliament and the Westminster Assembly. And what does this tell us about not only Featley, but what does this tell us about Puritanism, Calvinist conformity, and the politics of religion? On the 12th of June, 1643, Parliament issued an ordinance summoning an assembly of learned and godly divines. This gathering, known as the Westminster Assembly, was, quote, for the settling of the government and liturgy of the Church of England, and for the vindicating of the clearing the doctrine from the false aspersions and interpretations. Made up of approximately 150 members, the assembly was convened on the 1st of July, 1643, to refine orthodoxy in England following a decade of Laudian reform. Although it originally set out to revise the 39 articles, the assembly eventually produced a confession and 2 catechisms, collectively known as the Westminster Standards. Over the past 3 centuries, of course, numerous Reformed and Presbyterian denominations have adopted these standards, and have argued that they represent really the high point of orthodoxy in early modern England. Since the publication in 2012 of the Minutes and Papers of the Westminster Assembly, we have the most accurate account of what actually took place at the assembly. Of the 204 people invited to the assembly, 43 members declined their invitation, 31 of whom were clergymen. Although some declined for reasons of health or distance that they would have had to travel to attend, it seems that more than half likely declined their invitation because of a commitment to the monarchy and episcopacy, despite their close theological and social ties with the members. So just take that on. 31 people invited, and I'm arguing half of whom that declined their invitation. I'm arguing half of them declined their invitation because they're committed to episcopacy and royalism. Richard Baxter, for example, related that although Parliament invited, quote, the learnedest Episcopalian figures in Britain to avoid being perceived as impartial, so that, quote, each party would have liberty to speak, almost all of these divines declined their invitation because, according to Baxter, quote, it was not a legal convocation, and because the king himself declared himself against it. Indeed, Chad Van Dixhoorn notes that while Thomas Thorogood alleged that he had sympathized with episcopacy while he was in attendance, he was, however, a nominal member. So Thomas Thorogood was there. He was an Episcopalian, but he was more of a nominal member. And he almost, this is Van Dixhoorn again, quote, almost certainly did not stay for the duration of the gathering, and his performance at the assembly was undistinguished. Likewise, although the Episcopalian Thomas Westfield is recorded to have been in attendance, he too did not make a substantial contribution to the assembly. Although Featley was one of only roughly 15 Episcopalians who accepted his summons to participate meaningfully in the Westminster Assembly, he later said that he regretted his attendance precisely because Charles opposed it. And we're going to look at those claims and the ways that Featley thinks about himself retrospectively. Thus, this paper will explore Featley's participation in and eventual imprisonment by the Westminster Assembly. It will examine why Featley attended the assembly instead of siding with the Royalists, especially since nearly all of the assembly members were opposed to some of his theological positions. By examining the theological positions and pressures that motivated and shaped Featley's actions in the escalating conflict, his predicament is most clearly shown. We're going to be looking at his predicament. In particular, this paper will contribute to understanding the ever elusive theme of moderation. We'll be looking in particular at how what I'm going to be arguing contributes to Ethan Shagan's arguments in The Rule of Moderation, showing how Featley's pursuit of a middle way was fueled by a survival instinct. It was this survival instinct, however, that led to his downfall. So first, we're going to look at Featley at the Westminster Assembly. Featley was an active participant during his short stint at the Westminster Assembly. He was part of the Second Standing Committee, which was responsible for revising the 39 Articles. He was also on a committee appointed to investigate antinomianism. This makes sense given his previous interactions with so-called Puritan antinomians in the 1620s, and indicates that antinomianism had continued to be an ongoing issue with Puritans in the 1640s. Now, the minutes give us a window into the considerable debates that took place between assembly members over theological issues and an appreciation of the differences of opinion between assembly members. And they reveal that Featley played an active role in these debates. An awareness of these debates cautions us, of course, against assuming that assembly members were naturally united on theological issues simply because they arrived at the theological consensus enshrined in the Westminster Standards. Featley printed 8 speeches that he gave at the assembly in his Sacra Nemesis that was published in 1644. And these were reprinted. This is a different chapter, but presumably by his nephew, John Featley, in the 6th and 7th editions of Featley's Dippers Dipped in 1651 and 1660. And I actually discovered just yesterday, also in the 5th edition in 1647. Thank you, Chad, for that. I went back and was looking through some of my notes. These speeches were meaningful contributions to several theological debates and give historians a valuable window through which we can understand the assembly's proceedings. Now, just going to give a brief summary of his speeches. 2 speeches concerned whether the 3 Catholic creeds should be unreservedly accepted. 5 speeches concerned the imputation of Christ's active obedience and justification, and his final speech opposed the Solemn League and Covenant. Now, while his final speech was against the consensus, his other speeches sided actually with the majority in the assembly. Since Featley's contribution to these debates has been fruitfully explored by other scholars in recent years, particularly Dr. Van Dixhoorn, this study and this paper won't reproduce this work. However, it will add that Featley appears to have had a considerably more reliant on patristic sources than the other assembly members. quoting extensively and considerably from major church fathers like Justin Martyr, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory the Great, and John Chrysostom. This confirms our previous analysis, or my previous analysis, of Featley's use of patristic tradition. That's a major theme in my other chapters, how Featley uses patristic tradition in his debates with Catholics and anti-Calvinists. It also reveals that this was a major part of Featley's lifelong polemical strategy. As Featley had argued in his debate with the Catholic John Fisher, for example, as the River Jordan, quote, as the River Jordan is most clear and sweet river near the springs and head, in like manner, the doctrine of the church near the fountain and spring in the time of the apostles ran most sweetly and clearly. So you can see he clearly favors the apostolic tradition and puts a high priority on that. Now, Featley's approach, though, diverged from the modus operandi of the other assembly members, who believed that doctrinal matters must be settled primarily on the basis of Scripture. Chad Van Dixhoorn has even suggested that the printing of Featley's speeches were designed to, quote, expose the anti-creedalism present at the assembly, which I think is really spot on. This was only the beginning of the disagreements between Featley and the other assembly divines, and demonstrates that the differences that would eventually divide Featley from the other assembly members were deeper than simply matters of ecclesiology, something that I think can get easily missed. It's also an example of the value that ministers placed on tradition, that issue continued to be an issue in the 1640s amongst Puritans and Calvinist conformists, just as it had during the 1630s. Finally, historians should be cautious about accepting Featley's accounts at face value, since these were his own retrospective perspectives on his participation at the assembly, and from which he was, of course, eventually dismissed and imprisoned. It's to that event which we will now turn. Now, one question that has perplexed historians is, given the Westminster Assembly's opposition to some of Featley's theological positions, why did Featley attend the assembly instead of siding with the Royalists and going to Oxford? Crucial to giving a satisfactory answer is exploring the reasons why Featley accepted the assembly summons. Now, the summons pronounce that the present church government, based on the hierarchy, is evil and justly offensive and burdensome to the kingdom, and a great impediment to the reformation and growth of religion. Therefore, it needed to be replaced with one that was, quote, most agreeable to God's holy word and most apt to procure and preserve the peace of the church at home and near agreement with the Church of Scotland and the other Reformed churches abroad. Since other Reformed Episcopalians declined their invitations, Featley later attempted to procure royalist favor by claiming in his prison writings that he regretted his decision and attended the gathering, saying that this choice was, quote, his greatest fault, and that he often wished himself out of it. Now, several theories have been proposed by Featley's contemporaries and later historians regarding what motivated Featley to side with the parliamentarians in the summer of 1643. For example, Thomas Fuller, the great 17th century historian, accepted Featley's claim, saying that during the assembly, Featley's, quote, body was with them while his heart was at Oxford. Peter Heylin, whose, of course, his works are not without significant issue. If you've read Anthony Milton's excellent book on that, you'll know that Heylin had a pretty overt and clear agenda, sometimes that he stated even explicitly. He surmised that Featley attended the assembly, quote, to show his parts or head a party, or out of his own love to Calvinism. Now, Edward Hyde maintained that his attendance was, quote, purely out of conscience and for the service of the king and church, and hoped that he might be able to prevent many extravagancies and to contain those unruly spirits with some bound of regularity and moderation. Each of these conclusions, however, and this is key, was derived from viewing the events through the lens of their own retrospective post-Restoration conceptions about the dichotomies that eventually led to the English Civil War. So, Reformed theology and anti-Calvinism, royalism and parliamentarianism, radicalism, conservatism. So, for example, it's not surprising that Peter Heylin reduced Featley's attendance to a love for Reformed soteriology, since his writings, that is Heylin's, portray Reformed doctrine being at odds with true royalism and a correct embodiment of the English church. That's a huge theme of Heylin's writings. Further, both Edward Hyde and Thomas Fuller's minimizations of Featley's attendance records also accords with their overall biases. No self-respecting and true royalist and Episcopalian, this would be them, would have dared to associate himself voluntarily with parliamentarian Presbyterians unless his motive was to oppose them as a true champion of true religion. However, I'm going to argue that in order to understand why Featley accepted the summons, we need to analyze the escalating conflict, that is the context, of the years leading up to the Westminster Assembly. From 1641 to 1643, Featley witnessed the growing marginalization of royalism and episcopacy by an increasingly powerful parliamentarian party. This began as early as March of 1641 with Featley's participation in the Williams Subcommittee of Religion, sometimes known as the Williams Committee, named after the committee's chair, the Bishop of London, John Williams. This committee, made up of Reformed Episcopalians and moderate Presbyterians, was convened, now this is fascinating, I think, was convened to reach a consensus regarding ministers' concerns about the issues of established church polity and ceremonies following the decade of Laudian reform. So you see them getting together, convening this committee to see if there might be a workable way forward in 1641. Now, although the committee initially looked like a promising solution to these issues, it was dissolved by Parliament within a few weeks. Then, in January 1642, Charles flees from London to Oxford following a series of unsuccessful attempts to seize political control of the country. So you see how things are mounting here. This geographical departure, it's been argued by historians, effectively reinforced in a physical way the theological and political divisions that had existed. It opened up a physical space between the two parties. Surrendering this political stronghold to his enemies had devastating implications for Charles and the Royalists. Although war was now probable, it was obvious that Charles and the Royalists were in the far weaker position. Now, throughout 1642, the circumstances continued to darken for Featley and other Royalist ministers in London. On the 29th of October, 1642, a number of ministers, including two of Featley's fellow Episcopalian Williams Committee members, in fact, John Hackett and Richard Holdsworth, were in prison. Then on the 2nd of December, a committee was convened to relay the names of, quote, all malignant, scandalous, and seditious ministers in London to the Lord Mayor by that next Friday. It was reported by England's Memorial Accidents, that's a publication, print publication, that these ministers should, quote, be removed from London since they sow discord continually, both in public and in private, and incite the people against Parliament and persuade them not to contribute any moneys, plates, arms, or horse for the defense of king and Parliament. That was something that Featley got in trouble for. And now this last phrase was revealing, since failing to contribute was one of the accusations that actually the Committee of Plundered Ministers made against Featley. Now, at this time, Featley was beginning to experience the grim circumstances of war firsthand, enduring two different attacks on his life on the 12th of November, 1642, and the 19th of February, 1643, in his churches in Lambeth and Acton. Now, if you think you have difficulties in your local churches, it compares nothing. Immediately following the second attack in March of 1643, some of his parishioners reported him to the Committee of Plundered Ministers for introducing Laudian innovations into his church. So you see what's happening. Anybody who bowed the knee in the 1640s or in the 1630s under Laud is being brought in and being questioned by this committee. If the committee found him guilty, Featley would have been imprisoned, stripped of his ministerial positions and his two handsome parish livings. Now, given how events had unfolded for other royalist ministers, it seemed Featley was about to lose everything. However, a beacon of hope came for Featley in the middle of the trial. On the 24th of June, 1643, Parliament issued the Westminster Assembly summons, and Featley was invited to the gathering. On the 1st of July, 1643, only days before the trial verdict, Featley took his seat at the first assembly meeting. His participation seems to have made all the difference in improving his fortunes. For 11 days later, on the 11th of July, 1643, Featley was released of all charges in a close vote, 69 to 60. In his diary, the MP for Ockhampton, Lawrence Whitaker, and this is in the British Library, he linked Featley's favorable outcome with his participation at the assembly, saying that Featley was acquitted on account of, quote, his good deserts to the church hereunto, and because he was, his good defense to the church hereunto, and because he was chosen as a member of the synod. Featley was not the only royalist minister preserved by accepting the assembly summons. In his diary, the Norfolk minister, Thomas Thorogood, narrated how in 1642, he, quote, entertained a group of royalists in his house for several days. This news eventually reached the committee, where he was accused and threatened and expected to be in prison for receiving these royalist ministers. Although 4 soldiers came to arrest him, according to Thorogood, quote, Providence intervened and he was appointed, quote, to the assembly. These cases demonstrate that at the beginning of the English Civil War, it was possible for outspoken, reformed royalist divines to avoid persecution by declaring their allegiance to the parliamentarian cause by attending the Westminster Assembly. Now, let me just pause here and say it's impossible to prove definitively that Featley accepted his invitation to the Westminster Assembly to avoid imprisonment and to avoid losing his ministerial positions and livings. Given the timing of the events leading up to the decision and Featley's actions before and after the assembly, however, this clearly seems to be his motivation. Since Charles had condemned the Solemn League and Covenant and the assembly immediately following the summons, Featley knew the predicament he was entering into with the royalists. Featley's livings were also undoubtedly important to him. Reflecting on losing them, he said, quote, the sequestration of my benefice made me lifeless, or rather, according to the apostle's phrase, twice dead, and plucked up by its roots. For as good upon the matter to be dead, as deprived of all means of livelihood. And this is something really interesting about Featley. I think Featley actually marries for money. He is someone who clearly likes to have a good living. That's very important to him. It's something that was important to him throughout his life. And he understood that he could not keep his livings without siding with the parliamentarian cause. Indeed, although his own account of the vote by Featley exaggerated his favorable outcome, he said that it was 80 to 60. It was actually 69 to 60. He likewise mentioned, quote, that now he is settled in both his benefices and locked fast into the assembly. You see his comment there. He's settled in his benefices. He's locked fast into the assembly. It's clear. There's a connection in his mind between those two. Now, it's a testimony to Featley's flexibility that in his prison writings, he managed to justify the decision on the basis of his circumstances at the time, while ultimately admitting that he regretted his decision. For example, he claimed that he, quote, conceived that he might do more hurt to himself by his presence there than good to others by his assistance. And therefore, when he heard that like the candle, he was blown in and out with the same breath, he passed not at all for it, deeming himself neither a gainer by one, nor a loser by the other. He also claimed that his participation was contingent upon the assembly's compliance with established church orthodoxy and practice. However, saying that, quote, he joined with the assembly, now this is key, he joined with the assembly, quote, so long as they joined with the truth. And when they undermined it, he countermanded them, end quote. And that he, quote, often wished himself out of it because this assembly was not called by the sound of Moses, his silver trumpet, obviously speaking there of Charles's royal authority. It was not called by the sound of Moses, his royal trumpet, neither were the members thereof elected or nominated by the body of the clergy. Nevertheless, we must be careful not to assume too much about Featley's political sensibilities, for no one who was caught up in these developments knew exactly how events would unfold. So I'm just qualifying all of that. I don't want to get teleological. We have to remember Featley's caught up in the middle of this, but he is depicting himself rather interestingly in his retrospective accounts. Now, in this light, it may be inferred that one of the reasons Featley recanted his decision and penned two lengthy defenses of episcopacy, which he did in his imprisonment from prison, was to dispel any doubts about his royalist Episcopalian status, especially given his initial decision not to follow the king to Oxford and to participate in an assembly with Charles's enemies. In fact, Featley and his nephew claimed that Featley's refusal to submit to the assembly's enforcing of subscription to the Solemn League and Covenant that signaled that his time at the assembly might be limited. So it was Featley siding, they're saying, against the Solemn League and Covenant. That was really the writing on the wall that Featley's time might be over. Listen to how John Featley relates this. Quote, his speech in the assembly against the covenant was at that time so distasted that his impatient and too zealous brethren suffered him not to render those his reasons in defense of episcopacy, which are added to this work. When they therefore hastened to swear the league, he retired to his house to grieve and pray. And from that time forward, he was neither secure in his study nor safe in his house. It was his seeming sin that he so freely delivered his conscience, and his punishment was plundering, sequestering, imprisonment, and death. Now, it's impossible to know precisely how Featley's plans developed as the conflict escalated. It's feasible, however, that it was part of his contingency plan to, quote, continue his attendance at the assembly until he could leave on fairer terms. Although this opportune time never arrived, the fact that he crafted an exit plan demonstrates that Featley sought to maneuver his ship to safer waters in response to the turbulent circumstances he faced. In reality, the only way forward in the conflict was to choose a party and remain therein. Alan Ford, for example, has related that James Usher understood that in the escalating conflict, steering a middle course was, quote, hardly a practical long-term policy. Thus, on the 1st of September, 1642, when the Commons rejected his arguments in favor of episcopacy, Usher joined Charles in Oxford. Although his initial political statement signaled that he sided with the royalists, the decisive public breach was Usher's rejection of the Westminster Assembly summons because the king forbade him from attending. Attendance at the Westminster Assembly was the definitive litmus test for determining the political allegiance of Reformed clergy. By examining the terminological parallels between the Westminster Assembly summons and the Solemn League and Covenant, Chad Van Dixhoorn has shown that, quote, the wording of the Solemn League and Covenant focused on the wording which was previously used in the Assembly's summoning ordinance. The Covenant, like the summoning ordinance, quote, called for the extirpation of prelacy, which was defined as the church government by archbishops, bishops, their chancellors and commissaries, deans and chapters, archdeacons, and other ecclesiastical officers pretending upon their hierarchy. This was a deliberate decision, this is Van Dixhoorn, that underlined the continuity between the mandate of the covenant and their own initial task. And also intentionally, again, Van Dixhoorn arguing, quote, it also intentionally, quote, put those divines who objected to the covenant in an awkward place. How could Featley, Cornelius Burgess, and other friends object to the very phrases they had tolerated only months before? The parallels nullified Featley's disapproval of the covenant on the basis of canon law. So you see the argument. There's such parallels between the assembly summons and the Solemn League and Covenant itself. You cannot accept one and then reject the other. Since these parallels nullified Featley's disapproval of the covenant on the basis of canon law, both sets of canons had been made without the consent of Parliament, or rather in opposition to Parliament. Featley's protest was on the basis of canon law was unlikely, Van Dixhoorn argues, to garner much support among those who had already dared to come to Westminster against the king's expressed command. Indeed, like the other divines who were initially hesitant about the covenant, who eventually subscribed, even Thomas Thorogood, he subscribes in the end, who eventually pledged his allegiance to the Solemn League and Covenant, quote, after the rest, until not, I had given my reasons, especially in reference to episcopacy, for I presume the king's majesty and his posterity were well fenced therein. In this instance, it seems that Thorogood surpassed Featley in his political savvy, for he understood that the time for siding with Charles had passed, and his ongoing survival was dependent upon subscription to the covenant. Now, the narrative of the events of Featley's final weeks at the assembly before being imprisoned by his fellow assembly divines is indeed a remarkable tale. Chad, how much longer do I have? Just wanting to make sure I don't go over here and leave plenty of time for questions.
Sorry, I was checking your lip reading skills there briefly. And now that I'm unmuted, let me say this. The Q&A is valuable, but what you're doing is just so fascinating that I'm quite reticent to slow you down.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you fire away. We have a hard stop at about 6 o'clock.
Okay.
I'd rather hear your organized thoughts.
Yeah.
And then let people circle back with questions later. So you go to town.
Okay. So maybe I'll go to 6 o'clock. Well, try to end before 6, and leave questions. Okay.
That'd be brilliant.
Now, discerning the details of the events, which ones are true and which ones are false or exaggerated, is a challenge. And it's unclear what took place during Featley's final days before his imprisonment. This is because the fullest account of what happens is actually derived from John Featley's biography of Featley, which is a skewed source. I actually dedicate the last chapter to looking at why that is, but you'll have to take that for granted. Moreover, during this escalating conflict, John had actually fled England to the Isle of St. Kitts, and was there during the assembly. His account relied on Featley's own retrospective relations of the events, which, as we will see, was Featley's attempt to vindicate his largely marred reputation. Now, according to John Featley, so with that caveat, according to John Featley, in mid-September 1643, some, quote, schismatics and secretaries who envied Featley's gifts and disdained his defense of episcopacy and opposition to the covenant, hatched a plot to affright him into future compliance, or at least silence in the synod, and even to secure Featley's dismissal from the assembly and eventual imprisonment. During this time, a felt maker, I never get his name pronounced right, but Arminger Wardner, befriended Featley and confidentially relayed to him a message from James Usher, who was with the royalists in Oxford, that Charles was, quote, very much offended by his complying with the assembly, and that he charged him upon his high displeasure never more to meet with the divine. So this felt maker is giving Featley a message, apparently from Usher, from Charles. Now, although initially Featley was suspicious of the message, being surprised that Usher did not write directly to him, Wardner reassured him that it was due to, quote, the danger of the times. Now, Featley was now face to face with the dilemma that he had encountered throughout his entire ministry. How to maintain, on the one hand, cordial ties with his Puritan and now firmly parliamentarian contemporaries, while upholding his allegiance to the monarchy and the established church. As Featley later related, when he received the letter, he was, quote, much appalled and troubled, not knowing how to steer the course between the one and the other, nor to obey the contrary commands of two masters, end quote. Only 2 months earlier, Featley had been tried by the Parliamentary Committee of Plundered Ministers and narrowly escaped losing his pastoral post and his livings. And now he was being pressured by the opposing party to leave the assembly. In the midst of the eroding middle ground, Warner posed a solution to the predicament, offering to take a letter to Usher on his return, containing, quote, a few lines equating him, that is the king and Usher, with some passages of the assembly, and with his desire of his majesty's leave to continue his attendance there until he could leave on fairer terms. Now, although Featley was, quote, very desirous to make his peace with the king, that's according to him, he wanted to be cautious during the turbulent times, asking Warner if, quote, there could be any danger in sending the letter. With the reassurance from Warner that all would be well, Featley dictated a note to that effect and sent Warner on his way. Now, unbeknownst to Featley, and this is according to Featley, Warner was, quote, a great stickler for the new Reformation, who supposedly fabricated a message from Usher to entrap Featley. Following the receipt of the written reply from Featley, this is my favorite part, to Usher, Warner apparently, quote, soon departed, laughing in his sleeve, and showed the note to divers other encloseth with the committee, who did read the note and accused Featley of being a royalist spy and communicating intelligence to Oxford. On the 30th of September, 1643, Featley is imprisoned at the Lord's house in Aldersgate. He's removed from the assembly and imprisoned. His books were seized, his goods were plundered, and his handsome livings were sequestered. Now, there are several significant features of this account. I just want to point out a few things as we try to read against the grain of Featley's account. First, it's notable that Featley is portrayed as taking little responsibility for writing the note. Did you notice that? Rather, writing to Usher was not Featley's idea, but Warner's. This narration of the events was a deflection of responsibility from Featley to the messenger. There are hints that Featley was fully aware of his predicament, however. His pursuit of reassurance from the messenger that he was not in danger of committing something politically treasonous is an indication that he was quite aware that in continuing to play both sides, he was actually engaging in seemingly wrongful activity. It's an indication, too, of Featley's political flexibility that even after his arrest and imprisonment, he continued to plead ignorance by portraying himself as one who was easily duped by an ordinary layman acting on behalf of his now parliamentarian enemies, rather than owning up to what was really going on. Additionally, the message or pretended message and Featley's reply were both a testimony to his predicament, whether or not Charles or Usher had actually given the message for Featley or not. Indeed, Featley's reply makes clear that in his own eyes, he was a royalist, and that Charles's message or pretended message indicates that Featley knew that as a royalist, he had no business being in an assembly summoned not by royal authority, but by Parliament. For why else would Featley have been so alarmed at Charles's message? Featley's reply to Charles, however, is a further indication of his political sensibilities. Rather than admitting his wrongdoing and attending the assembly, he attempted to obtain permission from Charles to continue staying at the gathering. For Featley could never divulge the real reason he attended the assembly, since that would have put his status as a true royalist and Episcopalian in jeopardy. Now, following his imprisonment in 1644, Featley sought to vindicate himself from all accusations by writing two anonymous works, Sacronemesis and The Gentle Lash. He attempted to clear himself of all charges and then to demonstrate that he was both a non-treasonous reformed member of the assembly and a committed royalist Episcopalian. So he's still not trying to give way to the fact that these things have divided. For example, he claimed that his note to Usher was entirely innocent, which I think it probably was actually. Though the Commons accused him of being a, quote, spy and intelligencer to Oxford, Featley claimed that his letter contained, and that they claimed that Featley's letter contained, quote, great imputations upon the proceedings of the assembly and diverse members both of the assembly and parliament. In response, Featley claimed that this note was not an unsealed note. It was a note unsealed, not a letter, containing no imputations at all upon the assembly or parliament, or an account of his good service he had done to the king, but was a mere relation of the last three resolves upon the question in matter of faith at the assembly. He also argued that since the 22nd of October 1643 law against sending correspondence to Oxford had not yet been passed, he was not yet guilty. See what he's saying? He's saying that because the law hadn't been passed yet, he couldn't possibly be guilty of this crime. Likewise, he argued, in writing a letter to Ussher, he was merely writing, I love this, to another chosen member of the assembly. This argument, of course, is a red herring, since Ussher's rejection of his invitation and public denouncement of the assembly gathering effectively made his the previous assembly summons null and void. The reality is Ussher chose his side. The decision about whether to accept or reject the summons, as I argue, became the litmus test for determining which side one was on. Now, I want to point out one other thing about this, about the relation. He provided several reasons why the parliamentarians fabricated this account to imprison them. Now, Featley claimed that one of the chief reasons he was targeted was that the greedy parliamentarians wanted to seize his handsome livings, which were, quote, like the pine and a web in the eye of envy. He asserted that since they were, quote, conveniently seated near London, and one hath a good friend of the air and the other of the Thames, the mouth of some of the assembly watered after them. So he's saying they want to get rid of me so they can take my my homes. Moreover, he was no royalist spy, he argued. Rather, the Commons had already made up their minds that anyone who sent a letter to Oxford was a spy by default. Finally, Featley and his nephew claimed that he was imprisoned because of his, quote, loyalty to his conscience and to his prince and his opposition to the Solemn League and Covenant. I said the final point hits closest to the mark, actually, in determining why Featley was targeted and imprisoned. Now, other Reformed divines were apparently influenced by Featley's testimony. For example, in his Sacred Nemesis, Featley included letters from foreign Reformed divines attesting to his Reformed credentials and his innocence. One divine, John Stables, wrote that he was, quote, sorry to hear of the close imprisonment of worthy Dr. Featley, and that, quote, one is and has ever been so stout a champion for religion to be so used by the reformers. Featley also included a letter from his Dutch translator, the translator of Ancilla Pietatis, Wolfgang Mayer, who in 1642 may have actually recommended Featley to be appointed as the next chair of divinity at Leiden University. John Featley, that is, claimed that Featley declined this invitation to become a professor at the chair of divinity at Leiden because he was, quote, unfit to alter his climate by reason of age and other infirmities, and for other reasons that his nephew fails to disclose. Now, Daniel Featley claimed that he was previously hesitant to release these letters for fear of, quote, whetting the venomous tooth of envy against him. But considering what condition the party is now, I held it a duty of Christian charity and equity to impart them to the indifferent reader for the vindicating his person and adding some light to his reputation, now laboring in eclipse. Most obviously, though, Featley's strategy is an example of how one divine attempted to use his past Reformed credentials and the continental favor to boost his standing amongst English Reformed divines. This indicates that foreign Reformed approval continued to shape the Reformed landscape during the English Revolution. Now, Featley's use of testimonies was a part of his wider program of demonstrating that he was a legitimate member of the assembly. Sorry, I just got distracted there. And defender of the true Reformed religion, who was being imprisoned as an enemy of Parliament. Featley described how in 1642 he was, quote, chosen by 390 votes to be a member of the assembly, but was specifically commissioned, quote, by the whole House of Commons to answer a popish priest and his work, A Safeguard from Shipwreck to a Prudent Catholic. Now, Featley's response in 1642 was a reprint of The Safeguard from Shipwreck with Featley's own marginal notes, written to serve as a, quote, antidote against those places where he rankest poison, or where the rankest poison is couched. According to Featley, the priest's work was written, quote, to show all Roman Catholics a way to escape not only all bonds and imprisonment, but all other penalties of the law against popish recusants, by making their religion and conscience to comply with the religion professed by the state, wheresoever they live, and taking the oath of allegiance and supremacy. Now, according to Anne Davenport, Parliament believed that the Catholic appeal to take these oaths was part of an attempt to infiltrate the English government through outward conformity. Therefore, while Featley's debunking of this Catholic's argument was in many ways extremely to his other anti-Catholic arguments, his acting as Parliament's defender was in fact still a demonstration of his own Reformed credentials. He further pleaded his credentials as a champion of true Reformed religion, asking several questions. Did he not, quote, stand up for the true Reformed religion in the kingdoms both of England and in France? That reference to France is when he was a chaplain to Thomas Edmonds at the beginning of his career. Did he not oppose Arminianism when it was in the fullest rough, and when the crime was capital to speak against it? Were his lips sealed? He asked rhetorically. Now, his defense was indeed costly. According to Featley, his publishing of his 2 works against Richard Montague resulted in him losing the possibility of preferment. Even in the most difficult years of Laudian persecution, Featley argued that he did not, quote, like cowards, run away to New England, or when old England was on fire. He claimed that he, quote, courageously, and this is a reference to William Laud, looked the lion in the face, and when he roared, he trembled not. Further, he claimed that when all others had turned the altars, his was not movable. Now, Featley's retrospective reading of these years should be questioned. I show in some of my previous chapters that while Featley did in fact oppose anti-Calvinism in the 1620s and 1630s, this hostility was also matched by a measure of ecclesiastical positioning that was designed to engender anti-Calvinist favor towards him. Nevertheless, Featley managed to convince some of the prominent Restoration Puritans to accept his perspective. For example, Richard Baxter reflected on Featley's imprisonment, saying, quote, "It much reflected on the Parliament, because whatever his fact were, he was so learned man as was sufficient to the dishonor those he suffered by." This is an illustration of how post-Restoration Puritans who approved of the assembly, could be persuaded to accept Featley's testimony. Featley's prison writings also demonstrated that he was a defender of the true established church and the monarchy. By opposing the Solemn League and Covenant, he claimed he was upholding the commitment to his ordination vows and the king. I think this is really fascinating. The Solemn League and Covenant was an agreement made, obviously, in 1643 between the English Parliament and the Scots to reform the doctrine and discipline of the Church of England following years of Laudian innovation. Now, part of the program was not only getting rid of episcopacy, but it was also addressing the king's majesty, person, and authority in the preservation and defense of true religion. The last phrase is especially important, since Parliament also endeavored to punish any person suspected of hindering the reformation of religion. Even though Featley's opposition to the covenant signaled that he was a potential enemy of Parliament, he claimed that by subscribing to the covenant, he and they would be breaking their previous ordination vow to obey the king and the bishop. And do you catch that? He's saying that we can't take this vow, we can't take this oath because we've already made a previous vow. He said, quote, both myself and all who have received orders in this kingdom by the imposition of episcopal hands have freely engaged ourselves by oath to obey ordinary and to submit to his godly judgment, and in all things lawful and honest to receive his commands. If then we now swear to endeavor the abolishing of episcopacy, we swear to renounce our canonical obedience. Now, as Merculus, maybe you can help me pronounce that, Chad, but Merculus.
Mercurius?
Alatus?
Is it Mercurius? Yeah, never mind. You go ahead.
Yep. The ministers of the Church of England at their ordination take an oath that they will reverently obey their ordinary and their other chief ministers of the church, and then to whom the government is charged and committed to them. Thus, if we shall swear the doing away of prelacy, we shall swear to forswear ourselves. Featley was not the only minister who was reluctant to take the Solemn League and Covenant. William Prince and even the would-be assembly proloctor Cornelius Burgess had reservations about subscribing to the covenant, though each of them pledged their allegiance in the end. Featley even claimed that he endeavored to prove that all the divines were wrapped in and now bound, were entangled in perjury by breaking the oath of canonical obedience. He argued that it was not he who was politically disobedient, but the covenanters, who by submitting themselves to the covenant had broken their previous vows to king and country. Those who recanted the, quote, oath of canonical obedience they took to their bishops, he boldly charged that they had discarded their ordination vows, and then they must, quote, repent also of their orders given them by bishops, for their orders were given to them upon the undertaking to perform these duties. Featley's rebukes were designed to strip these divines of their ministerial credentials and the authority that came with the office, thereby weakening the legitimacy and authority of their opposition, to his doctrinal positions. Now, Featley's commitment to royal supremacy was also at the core of his argument. He took exception to the phrase in the Solemn League and Covenant.
Greg,
Yes.
just one thought. Sorry to interrupt. So this sounds like another important argument that you're about to make. I wonder if we could, if you can state that succinctly, then people will just have an opportunity to ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
Which is, you're a great resource in multiple ways, but that would be helpful.
Yeah. So the basic summary of my argument here is that Featley has a commitment to really to royal supremacy. He actually outlines this in 1660 in his work, The League Illegal, where he gives a full defense of royal supremacy. And he's tying royal supremacy here to the ordination vows and to the fact that we can pursue the reformation of religion, but we cannot oppose the king. And he actually grounds this in a number of exegetical scriptural passages, particularly Romans 13, verse 1, not surprising. And his arguments actually parallel that of James Ussher. I mean, they're lock and step on the same page here. He also lists a number of reasons defending episcopacy, which seems to be a more moderate form of episcopacy rather than a Jura Divino form of episcopacy, and very similar to that of James Ussher, which is interesting. Ussher pens The Reduction of Episcopacy that's circulating in manuscript form in the early 1640s, but it is actually published posthumously in 1656. And what's interesting is that that actually could have potentially been a mediating ground coming out of the Williams Committee, but it's never pursued in the end because Ussher's reluctant to publish it. Now, can I just conclude here with a handful of just summary points, and then we can have time for questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight a handful of things that I've tried to point out in this paper. First, the importance of church tradition in making one's arguments. That for Featley, I think this was something distinct. Second, I would argue that Featley's kind of pursuing a middle way helps us to understand something of moderation. English moderates, according to Ethan Shagan, were those who were most vicious towards those who were on the margins. But what's interesting is we can also think about moderation or pursuing a middle way, not just as a polemical tactic and not just as something that is a more ironic position, but moderation can actually be conceived of something of a survival instinct. I also want to argue that hidden behind the obvious issue of whether Featley was a loyal member of the assembly or a royalist spy is actually a more interesting story. It's a narrative of how one minister attempts to desperately evade the polarizing rift forming at the beginning of the English Civil War. And I think that's really important, that when we think about a minister in history and historical theology and context, we have to see that Featley is, I think, like many of us, as we think about even our own political situation, he's making a calculated move. And then he's attempting to work within this while also holding on to two polar opposite views. As Thomas Gattaker said when reflecting on these conflicts, those that dwell in the middle between two adverse parties are wont to be beaten on both sides. In short, Featley's fortune was a warning of the times. It's no longer possible to serve two masters.
Well, a wonderful treatment, and just kudos to you for unraveling so many of the complexities of Featley himself and the Featley arrest story. I really look forward to the full the full book coming out next year. Is that the plan? 2021?
Yes, it'll be out next year.
I am eager. This is a wonderful preview and a coherent argument all at once. Our practice is to give PhD and THM students first go at asking questions, and we have a couple minutes here. So feel free to make a point or ask a question, but use an economy of words.
I have lots of questions, but that probably means I should let someone else go first.
And you give us one, James.
Please.
Okay. One point that struck me early on when you're discussing Calvinist conformity is that you don't mention something I would consider absolutely essential, and that is more or less uncompromised loyalty to and use of the prayer book.
Yeah, I thought I mentioned that. No, I think that's exactly right. I think, when we look at what makes Calvinist conformity, it is a commitment to the Book of Common Prayer. It is a commitment to the forms of the Book of Common Prayer. It's a commitment to upholding what you might think of as the liturgy and the way of doing a church service, and all of all of the different forms that go along with that, the ecclesiastical dress, and the commitment, and on some degree to the church calendar, although Featley had his own, he had his own quarrels about the church calendar that actually got him in big trouble in the 1630s. But you're absolutely right. We see in Puritanism, and this was maybe part of my definition of Puritanism, at least some reticence, reluctance, opposition to, desire to reform the Book of Common Prayer, and that's not present in Featley.
Just quickly, and then I'll defer to someone else and come back with time, as I would link and associate that as part of the larger web that includes fealties, excuse the pun, Featley's fealty to tradition. I mean, that this is very much part of a larger ethos, or what the French would call a mentalité.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent point. Thank you, James.
Other questions or comments about Dr. Salazar's research or about this paper? Yeah, Nate.
Hi, Dr. Salazar. I'm wondering if the Covenanters responded to Featley's accusation that they were the ones that were actually unable to hold the vows because he had previously taken vows, or I'm assuming the English Covenanters, the Scots would have been under different vows, the commissioners, but how did they respond to his accusation that the previous vows negate the Solemn League and Covenants vows?
Yeah, I don't really recall them responding specifically to Featley. I've often thought about this in terms of the developing theology of resistance and regicide. I did a lecture on this when I was at Cambridge with Arnold Hunt, looking at the ways in which the ideas of resistance and regicide really you could say mature from, say, the 1638 Scottish Covenant all the way to the end of the 1640s with the beheading of the king. And I think what you see is Featley kind of in the middle of that, kind of taking one position while this maturing doctrine of resistance and regicide is taking place, and really trying to point out some of the inconsistencies of it. So I think they would say that by the time you get to even 1643, the tipping point has begun to be reached, and obviously it takes off and increases throughout the 1640s. But I think the undergirding proposition, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Dr. Van Dixhoorn. I would argue that the undergirding proposition is something like, well, the king is no longer committed to true religion, and in essence, as a defender of the faith, which is part of his office, and therefore his legitimacy as an authority and the connection between those vows are increasingly delegitimatized.
Yeah, that sounds like classic Covenanter response for sure.
Well, I definitely want to let people feel free to get off the call. People have had to sort of dribble off as time goes on, and I want you to feel free to do that. But maybe we can keep you for 1 or 2 more minutes.
I was told I had till 6:10.
Oh, you have till 6:10. Oh, well, if that's what you were told, let's live it up. That's great. I need to get with the program, don't I? So other questions or comments before we cycle back to James, who has probably any number of appreciative comments and questions. Go ahead, James.
Okay. First, I don't know if this was intentional, and that's one of the things I want to ask about, but overall, your presentation of Featley and his maneuvering back and forth with all this tends to give the impression that you think he was rather disingenuous, or maybe even attempting to be opportunistic. Do you think that, or am I drawing a wrong inference?
Good question. That is something that I've had to pull back from a good bit. I think when you think about these contexts, I actually don't think opportunistic, in a kind of armchair world, maybe that makes sense. But when you're thinking about real people, real livings, real love for the Church of England, real commitment to real theological priorities, and having to live out the realities, and kind of that's a challenging thing. I found a fascinating, shoot me an email, I'll send you a picture of it, a fascinating print in the British Library. 5 different prints actually of what they called in the post-restoration a trimmer. Now that term doesn't actually start until 1680, I believe. But a trimmer is somebody, and you can see in the prints, right, it's somebody who's half Episcopalian, half Puritan, and has a picture of one person rowing one way and one person rowing another. And it's somebody who is a kind of chameleon, who goes, wherever the political winds blow you.
Right.
This is where I think John Coffey helped me to think about Featley. He's still convictional in the end, isn't he? I mean, at no point do we ever see him kind of crossing the guardrail. He goes right up to the line and then he stops. So that's principled. Now, it may be a broader principle than say the Assembly Divines, but you could argue, any kind of consensus, well, isn't that opportunistic? Well, I don't think so. I think it's more helpful to go just like, and I think it helps make sense, honestly, of the decisions that many of us make as we, are guilty either by association or things that we're willing to say and not willing to say. I think he just has his own theological bounds and priorities. He's willing to go all the way to one and not the other, and he's not willing to shoot himself in the foot if he doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's again, this is something that you've read a lot more of this than I have in these particular areas. But on the one hand, you mentioned the people like Fuller and Clarendon and Heylin who present post or ad hoc post hoc rationalizations for Featley.
Yes.
On the other hand, I tended to get an impression, and again, this may be just a wrong impression on my part, that going into the assembly and accepting the invitation that Featley is, you might say, aware of what's going on and is trying to make consciously or deliberately calculated moves accordingly.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if there isn't a third ground. And I mean, this is something that struck me from my own past studies in intellectual history, and that where you can have men who are incredibly bright in their intellectual fields of endeavor, and yet can be politically or socially extraordinarily naive, and where we would expect them to be able to gauge these things well, in fact, they can be incredibly obtuse and are in fact just stumbling and floundering about blindly because they simply don't have a well-developed political sense.
Yeah, I think that's where I think Featley does have a really well-developed political sense. I think he made a wrong calculation in the end.
Okay, so that's your stance.
But to be fair, it was something I didn't say, but Ussher wasn't being examined by the Committee of Plundered Ministers, yeah. Right? So I think, quite honestly, if he hadn't come under fire, he probably would have gone to Oxford.
Right. Yeah.
That's my
I mean,
opinion.
just to pick up one particular point that was striking for you mentioned that apparently Featley loved money, that he married well, that he was.
Yeah, I shouldn't have overstated that. Featley shouldn't.
Well, let's say he likes
necessarily
creature
connect the
comforts.
dots
He
there.
appreciates them. I mean,
He seems to appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, he after his chaplaincy in Paris, he moves to North Hill, which is in Cornwall, and is away from kind of all the learned, establishment. Longs to be in Oxford, longs to be in London. The reason he goes is because he has an incredible living offered to him.
Yeah. But so when you mentioned his writing in prison and accusing essentially those who imprisoned him of envy and greed, of wanting to seize his living.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, yes, I'm wondering why instead of that being kind of either or, if that couldn't be both and, just to take one example, that it could be the case that Featley indeed loved his creature comforts, and yet also that one of many motivations of those who put him in the clink was to try and get a hold of them for themselves or to pass them on to friends.
Yeah, I mean, Chad, are there other?
Yeah, I have kind of I don't want the last words here, so I want to be quite quick here, but I think the degree to which ministers in the 17th century are openly anxious about their economic uncertainties and opportunities is something that we would find awkward today. There's a sort of fairly frequent open interest in improving the economics of their household, anxieties about how much things are costing, and plaintive cries for better positions and better pay is not uncommon, even amongst those who by all appearances were reasonably paid at the point when they're writing these things. I mean, there are those who live in poverty, but there are those who are earning £100 a year. They have no real reason, if they live modestly, to want a place for 200, and yet it's fairly common. I would think. I think it's surprisingly common to hear people talking about salaries in a way that we would find sort of disturbing. I think today. There are counterexamples, but it is surprising. So I think the comments, even if they need to be softened on the edges, were quite fair, cutting in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I wouldn't. Being maybe a bit cynical, I wouldn't find that at all unusual today. I would take that as the norm. That we wouldn't find it any more disturbing today than back then. But that's me.
I think in reformed communities, we would think it was untoward to have some of the discussions had in reformed communities in 17th century England. Well, Greg, you get the last word, brother, because as we run out of time, the ball is in your court here. You get the last shot.
For me.
That's correct.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing to think about this, Amy Tan, who studied with Peter Lake, and I have kicked around the idea of writing an article on the cost of being a godly minister. That is the financial cost. And we live in a well-resourced time, right? Especially as Americans, in terms of accessibility to resources, etc. We need not forget that there is actually a tie between being able to do a fruitful ministry and sometimes the costs associated. You think about close proximity to certain libraries, etc. It's just not going to happen apart from a certain position or perhaps grant money, et cetera, et cetera. So I think probably Featley would have seen this, and I think many divines would see the material and the spiritual as one and the same and as part of calling.
Yeah. Well, let's leave on that edifying word. And we, that would indeed be a very interesting article. Trying to, sort of the cost of being a godly minister. You had a better title than that. Yeah, that would be interesting. And then it would also be interesting to understand the degree to which there's sort of cultural leakage from the most notoriously avaricious sort of papists and Episcopalians
Yes.
into the sort of the high climbing Reformed world, and see what kind of bleed there is in terms of kind of ambitions and desires. So, well,
thank you for having me. Thank you so much. This was a real treat, real privilege. Thank you.
I think I speak for all to say that it really feels like the privilege was ours. And we look forward to finding a way to invite you back for more as you continue this sort of fruitful stream of research and writing. So thank you very much. Let me close in prayer and praise God for his kindness to us. Gracious Father, thank you for this productive afternoon. Thank you for the gifts and graces that you've given to Greg Salazar. We pray that you will bless him as he continues this ambitious life of teaching, mentoring, researching, and writing for the good of your church and for the promotion of truth in the academic world and beyond. Will you continue to let your rich blessing rest on every good endeavor conducted and conceived of at Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. And we pray, Father, that the bonds of friendship and scholarly and churchly cooperation between Westminster and Puritan would continue to increase for the glory of your name. And we ask these things trusting in the powerful work of the Holy Spirit and praying them all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings, brothers. Look forward to another time. And we are, admittedly just learning how to do the kind of effective marketing that's always done at Puritan, including better circulating information about our seminars, advertising what we're doing. But I hope to get timely information to Puritans so you can invite your students to whatever
We would love that. And we would love to have you at our own Puritan Research Colloquium as well.
Well, I'll be in Grand Rapids in September 2021, so maybe I can drop by and knock on your door and get a coffee from you.
That sounds wonderful.
Okay. Blessings.
See
Thank you,
all.
Dr. Salazar.